Okay, well, thank you all for being here today. My name is Kate DeConnick. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. And along with Dr. Mike Williams, who's also one of our co-hosts for the event today, I'm one of the co-directors of an initiative at USD that's called the Urgent Challenges Collective. So we are an initiative that focuses on housing, homelessness, and food insecurity here in San Diego. So we promote research, teaching, advocacy, and kind of other initiatives to really try and tackle some of these crises in our city today. I'm going to start just with a little bit of framing for our event today. First things first, we are thrilled with the turnout for today's event. We have a lot more people who will be joining us along the way as well. And just so you know, we can't cover everything in our session today, right? So, Stephen Russell is going to talk to us about this upcoming ballot measure. He's an expert on this and many other things, but there are other facts and kind of resources that are also available on the Urgent Challenges Collective's website, which we can share with you in the chat in just a minute or two here. So if you are interested in more supplemental materials or other resources, we would strongly encourage you to visit that site. We also just wanted to acknowledge that we have a very diverse group of audience members today. We have students, undergraduate and graduate in law, and other students from the University of San Diego and other institutions here across the city. We have faculty members, we have community members, we have staff, we have administrators, and we just have some interested citizens here from San Diego who are all on this call with us. So, we hope this is going to make for a really rich conversation, with all of us here together. So it's good just to acknowledge that at the start. In just a moment, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Williams, who's going to introduce Stephen Russell, who is our speaker for today. But before we do that, I just wanted to share a couple of quick Zoom etiquette and navigation tips just to make sure that we're all on the same page for our event today. Okay. So first, because we have such a large audience today, we do ask that you please keep your microphone muted. This will prevent any distracting background noise. We would also strongly recommend that you please keep your camera off during the initial presentation. If you've been on many Zoom calls in recent history, you probably know that the more cameras are on, the more Zoom tends to lag or get a little bit choppy. So it's okay when we get to the Q&A portion in a little bit of time to turn your camera on then if you'd like to. But just for the time being, we just ask that cameras be off, which I see most of you are doing anyways. Good. And after the kind of initial presentation today, we will have time for questions and answers. We're going to try and save at least 15 or 20 minutes or so just to address questions from the audience. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to moderate questions using a shared Google document. So if you registered ahead of time for this event, you would have received the link to that in your email, but we will share it with you in the chat area as well. So if you are not super familiar with Zoom, if you need to get to the chat area, you just go to the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen and you can open up the chat window, and we're going to drop the link for the Google Doc there in just a minute. So any question that you want to ask, you can add to this document. If somebody has asked a question that you yourself would also like to hear interested, you can just put a little asterisk next to that question, and that tells us that there's a lot of interest in that one question, and it will allow us to prioritize some of the more, broadly interesting questions. Okay. Good. So I'm going to put that in the chat here. And in the meantime, I'm going to just turn the mic over to Dr. Williams, who's going to introduce Stephen Russell, our speaker for today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. DeConnick. We are just thrilled to have Stephen Russell join us this afternoon. He's been the executive director of the San Diego Housing Federation since 2015. But before joining the Federation, Stephen worked over 20 years in San Diego region on issues related to community and economic development. In 2010, he graduated from the New School of Architecture and Design, where he received a bachelor's degree in architecture, urban design, and sustainability. He is active on numerous boards and foundations in San Diego and throughout the state of California, and he is one of our community's strongest advocates for providing secure and affordable housing to everyone in San Diego. It's a real honor that you're with us here, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's very kind, and I'm really pleased to see such a great turnout for this event. And also, I see a number of colleagues here as well as part of the audience. So I think I've got some backup here in case I get myself in any trouble here. I know some folks will help me out. My name is Stephen Russell. I'm Executive Director of the San Diego Housing Federation. And I'm going to share, I don't have that many slides, but I'd like to share a few. So let's go ahead and Please see those now. So I'm here to talk about Measure A, so what we are putting forward as a solution for homelessness. To start with, the San Diego Housing Federation is a 501c3 nonprofit, and I got to give a shout out to the nonprofit sector because we are always stepping up to do the work that government isn't doing. And we're creative, we're innovative, we're small but mighty. Very pleased to have on this call today. I saw earlier Lauren Nunn, who is our Director of Policy and Programs. But we have a long history as for 30 years of being San Diego's voice for affordable housing. For those of you who are familiar with low-income housing tax credits, which is not most people, low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC, is the engine by which most affordable housing is being built. It's subsidized housing. It's a very complex way of building housing, and our organization formed 30 years ago in the wake of the tax legislation that created this mechanism to learn peer-to-peer. So a lot of small nonprofits, community development corporations, or CDCs, came together to teach each other how to best use this new tool to produce housing, and it's become an incredibly powerful tool over the years to produce almost virtually all the affordable housing that is produced in the nation, and most definitely in this region. We have over the years, our focus has shifted a bit. When we were a younger organization, when you think what the economy was like back then, the housing crisis wasn't a housing crisis, say in it wasn't a crisis of supply back in the 80s. What it really was a crisis of quality. Is that you had folks, you had new housing being built, mostly suburbs, you had families and upwardly mobile individuals moving. Even in San Diego, we didn't have the type of extreme white flight, which was actually incited by, well, that's a whole other story. Maybe we'll get into a little bit here. But you nonetheless saw that as families were formed and people moved out of neighborhoods, leaving behind housing that was aged and that was inexpensive. It was no longer in a desirable location. People were moving out. And so a lot of what we saw was a lot of older buildings being rented that were inexpensive but of low quality. And at the time, our mission really, the fulfillment of our mission, and our mission being, of course, to see that everybody has the opportunity for a safe, decent, affordable home. The way to achieve it back then was to upgrade, was to acquire and rehabilitate existing buildings for the most part, to make sure that they were of high quality and kept the rents low. Over time, of course, the crisis grew so much greater in terms of supply being, and we'll talk a little bit about supply, such that the challenge has been the affordability is at the forefront. Quality is, of course, is essential. It's a fundamental thing, but the simple availability of housing that's affordable to folks became more of an issue. Keep rolling forward, and what we see is that homelessness, as a result of the crisis in affordability, has grown. We'll go into that more in a little bit here, and that the solution to that is what we call permanent supportive housing, which is apartments, actual apartments that are individual leases that comes with services, so services that are appropriate to the population that they're serving. And so when we talk about, and this is going to weave through the rest of my talk, is what is the solution to homelessness? The solution to homelessness is a home. For many people who have lived on the streets for a year or more, or who have already had debilitating conditions before they even became homeless, staying housed is a challenge. Even if you can give someone an apartment that is affordable on, say, a $900 a month check. So if they're only paying $300 a month, if you give someone an affordable apartment, but you don't provide the services, if they've been living on the streets for a year or more, the trauma of that experience can be such that it's very challenging to stay housed. And so this is an important definition for this whole discussion, is the role of permanent supportive housing. It's not transitional housing, and that the permanent means someone has a lease. It's not a halfway house, it's not a recovery house, it is actually a home that someone has a lease and they abide by the lease regulations. And we provide services there. So what we've seen is that as time has gone by, our mission, the way we fulfill our mission has shifted, but it also recognizes that there's been a deepening crisis in affordability and that has had much broader impacts on folks. So the result of this is that we're bringing forward now, in November 3rd, it'll be on the ballot, Measure A, which was Homes for San Diegans. You may have seen some of that advertising before. Measure A is an effort to create enough affordable housing, enough permanent supportive housing, in fact, so that the folks who are living on our streets have the opportunity to have a home. What Measure A is, it's a $900 million general obligation bond for affordable and supportive housing. 2,800 of those are designated as permanent supportive housing units, which I just defined and described for you. The other 4,700 units that we think we could produce with this include homes for seniors, very low-income folks, seniors, veterans on low disability or very low income, veterans, seniors, transition-age youth, kids coming out of the foster care system, folks who are living with disabilities and are having difficulty actually participating in the economy as wage earners, and of course the folks who are homeless or are at great risk of being homeless. Not everyone who is homeless needs permanent supportive housing. People who have been homeless for short periods of time or maybe or have had housing instability, oftentimes all they need is an extremely inexpensive apartment. That's a challenge in itself to provide. It's folks who have been traumatized or went into, became homeless during the course of some critical episodes who really need those extra support services, which range, I should emphasize, depending on who you're serving. If it's a veterans building, and sometimes there will be a whole building just for veterans, then you want to have some military culture, sensitivity, understanding involved in that. Someone with an expertise in VA benefits, someone who understands maybe better what PTSD looks like. If it's a senior building and it's permanent supportive housing, the supportive services may be more medical, nutritional. It may be about reconnecting with family, or if it's a family building, and there are families who have been, although it's a relatively small number, but families who experience chronic homelessness, we would be focused more on preventions of fiscal literacy, of homework assistance for the kids, of maybe parental relationships. So the services would be tailored to the folks who are living there in permanent supportive housing, but also in affordable housing where we provide resident services. But Measure A is dedicated to providing $900 million to produce those units. The way we would pay for this is an ad valorem levy, which means by the value, on all real property in the city of San Diego. And what we're expecting is that we would issue these bonds, and this $900 million is the cap. What we would do is do a series of bonds until we built up to the 900. And you can see the chart there that describes roughly what we were talking about. And this was developed by debt management at the city. If the first year was 150 million, the next year maybe we put out another 125, and now we've got 275 million. And each year it steps up until year 7, we've got all 900 million out there actively working, producing housing. So that means we have a range in what we're repaying as bonds, starting with a tax rate of about $3.14 per 100,000 and going up to $20.85 per 100,000 once all $900 million is out on the street. What does that mean? For a homeowner, median homeowner with an assessed value, and let me be clear, it's not the market value, but the assessed value at $600,000, that would mean that you'd be paying $1.57 a month in the first year, rising up to $10.42 per month at the 7th year. Or if you're renting an apartment, a typical apartment that's been built in the last 5 or 8 years is probably worth about $375,000 on the assessor's books. You would pay, the landlord would pay, possibly pass it through, an additional 98 cents per month. And ultimately, once all the bonds are out there, about $6.51 per month. So the idea with an ad valorem tax is considered a progressive tax. That is, it lands more heavily on people who have more resources. It lands more lightly on folks who have few resources. That's what it's designed to be, and it's designed to be spread so widely that for 98 cents a month, we can get $150 million moved into producing housing. Important to note, too, is that when we do housing, affordable housing, the money we're talking about is just one slice in a whole stack of pancakes, if you will, of financing. We leverage this money about 3 to 4 times to 1 to actually produce the housing. So for our public cost, and it's actually considered a long-term loan that we put in there, our investment gets 4 times over, 3 to 4 times over in other capital sources. So it's actually relatively inexpensive a way to produce affordable housing from a public perspective. So why is this needed? This is really the meat and potatoes here. It's like, why do we have this crisis, and why do we believe this is part of the solution? First of all, we're all aware that homelessness has grown in the region in our lifetimes. And while it's gone up and down, if you notice, the numbers been between between 6 and 8,000. I'm sorry, I'm adding my numbers. I'm adding the wrong columns here. You can see, I'm going to let you see the trends here. In 2020, we're roughly about 2,700 sheltered and about 2,300 unsheltered. Those numbers haven't moved hugely except for a spike in 2017, but we're dealing with a fairly large population. And important to note, when we do our point in time count for the region, we've come up with, I believe our last point in time count was around 9,000 county-wide individuals who are homeless on that night. That's just on that night. In the course of that year, most people who experience homelessness actually do it in a transitory way. They're not chronically homeless. They have a short episode of homelessness. They may sleep in a car for a few months. They may sleep in someone's garage for a period of time. They may go from home to home to home, wearing out the welcome, staying as long as they can. All of those folks are considered functionally homeless. And the vast majority of people who are homeless actually are only homeless for a very short period of time. So whereas we counted 9,000 on the point in time count when we do the census of the homeless in January, there were approximately 24,000 who went in and out of homelessness in the course of the year. So it's a bigger problem than just the numbers on the street. We're very focused with permanent supportive housing on folks who are literally living on the streets and have done so long term. It's also worth noting that homelessness, we think of it as being well, there's a lot of myths we have about homelessness. One is that homeless people, don't have jobs. Well, in recent studies, we found that in this region, at least, half of the people who are homeless are working. So it's not that they're not working, it's that they don't have wages that support actually being able to afford rent. We also hear, of course, that folks are maybe coming here because it's so pleasant to be homeless here. And I would challenge any of you to find pleasantness in homelessness here, but people believe that, and it's certainly less challenging than other environments. But in the most recent survey, we saw that 88% of people became homeless while they were living here. It's very much, and more so, it's when we look at who is homeless, we look at the African American or Black population, which is roughly 5% of the population in San Diego County, but represents over 20% of those who are homeless. And so we're seeing that folks who are economically vulnerable are most vulnerable to homelessness, and these issues are compounded as prices go up, as wages fail to keep up, and as we continue to grow as a region without growing our housing supply. So homelessness is seemingly intractable, but we believe that we can, I hesitate to say solve it, but we can address it to the scale of the problem. That's really what we're looking to do here, bring this to scale. What else is driving homelessness? Well, the availability of affordable housing we've talked about is absolutely critical. And this chart shows us in the year 2000, we're talking about housing that was affordable to folks who are in the 50% of area median income and below. The median, of course, is the number that falls in the middle, where you've got equal number of people above, equal number of people below. So median income in this region is set by HUD and adjusted locally by the Housing Commission and authorities, is about, median is about 90,000 now, very close to 90,000. And so 50% of area median income is around 45,000 for a family of 4. So it's worth noting that how many people live at $45,000 and below in this region, how challenging that is. But if you go back to the year 2000 and with adjusted dollars looking backwards, there were 92,000 homes in the city of San Diego that were affordable to people at that income level. And when we say affordable, we talk about people spending roughly a third of their income to meet their housing needs, leaving the other 2/3 for, obviously for food, for transportation, for school, for medicine, for all the other things we spend on. But if you're spending more than when we say affordable, affordability depends on what you make, but it means across the board you should not be spending more than a third of your income on housing. So in the year 2000, there were 92,000 housing units in the city of San Diego that were affordable to households at 45,000 and below. By 2010, that number had dropped to 58,000. And by the year 2020, present day, we're at less than a third of the number of units that were affordable at that rate. And we're looking forward, by 2040, there may be as few as 9,000 left if trends follow out. That's 10% of what used to be available in 2000. Now these homes, it's worth noting, this is not largely from the destruction of housing. There is some, I might call it incidental destruction of housing. It's not incidental to the people who live there, but when you look at the larger numbers, it's typically maybe 2 units being destroyed to replace it with between 12 and 30. Or in many cases, mostly larger parcels typically are former commercial or industrial and don't actually involve the destruction of housing to produce new housing. It does happen, but the change in these numbers has entirely to do with the bidding up of existing housing stock. So what we see and we intuitively know is that folks who are middle income folks who make, above that 50% AMI, people who make 60 to 100, and actually 80 to 120% of AMI. So 72 to what is that? To 130,000 is middle income. Those folks are actually they have housing, and if they lose their housing, they find they have money, they go rent something. But very often, especially in the past 2 decades, they're renting something that was previously rented to someone of lower income. We may say, hey, the neighborhood's come up, rents are rising a little bit, that's gentrification. But what that means is that it's the replacement of somebody who is paying a low rent with someone who's paying a higher rent. So the housing stock hasn't been demolished in significant ways. It has grown, in fact. If you look at this chart, we see a slow growth in the number of housing units, but it's not kept up with the rate of growth of the region. And so we're seeing housing being bid up. When we look at production, one of the things we do as a region that is really important is the regional housing needs assessment, which is a way of trying to make sure that our local land use plans are harmonized with our expected growth plans. And it's mandated by the state. It's a process that we're still seeing going underway here in the San Diego County, where the state comes down with a number that is a reasonable projection of what housing growth is likely to be, or the demand likely to be, and we apportion it locally, city by city by city. For the region, however, so what we do is not just apportion it regionally, but we give allocations of you need so much middle income, so much high income, so much lower income housing to meet the needs based on our expected growth of household and jobs, because that's a key factor, is what do people earn. So to walk you through this chart that's up right now, the needs in these different categories are represented in the dark blue. That is what we project the need is going to be, and this is a 5-year estimate. 60,000 is what we needed in 30% AMI, so maybe 30,000 a year for a family of 4 and below. We've produced maybe 14,900 during that period of time, leaving a deficit of 45,000. Again, with 50% AMI, you can see the dark blue is 108,000. We've actually produced 60,000 during that period of time, leaving a big deficit. Once we get into middle and upper income, you see that we have produced actually a surplus, if you will, of housing. That is more than we generated need for during this time period. This doesn't really fully account for, they try to account for past deficits, but it doesn't fully account for decades of underbuilding. So what that means is we're definitely providing new housing at the high end of the market, and that makes sense. When you build a new place, you're using contemporary land value, contemporary materials, contemporary wages. That if you capitalize that expense and take out a loan, you're going to look at 10 years down the road, it's going to seem relatively inexpensive because inflation around you makes your place seem relatively inexpensive. But what's important to see here is that we're building more than enough housing at the high end of the market. And part of that is, you'd have to ask, why are we building more housing than there's actually demand for? And the key is that it's not actually measuring it against, we're measuring against the demand generated locally, but San Diego is not just a real estate market for San Diegans. We are so desirable, especially when you look at places like downtown, La Jolla, Coronado. Those are places that have very high numbers of folks who own second homes or vacation homes. Or in many cases, we see that there are places that are owned as asset protection. They're like safe deposit boxes, if you will, for a lot of folks who maybe live in foreign countries where the rule of law is not as reliable as it is in the U.S., and it's a way of parking assets offshore in a relatively liquid format. So we're building for folks who don't live here in some cases, and whereas that's, so we have a surplus in that area. And that also begs the question about, vacation rentals. If we're building and housing at the high end, and we're not producing more in the middle, but housing that would otherwise be rented to the middle market is actually going into short-term vacation rentals. We know there's a lot of housing that is what we would call off-market that is not actually made available, right, for long-term rentals. It's here, and it's a significant number. And it skews the vacancy rate here in the city, because when the vacancy rate is low, then landlords have an advantage. When the vacancy rate is high, tenants have an advantage in negotiating a rent. So short-term vacation rentals, you may say they can't have too much of an impact. If you can take 2 or 3% of the housing stock off market and you change the vacancy rate by 2 or 3 points, you could shift it from tenant favoring to landlord favoring just with a few points. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here. In San Diego, we are at the intersection of all of these. Also, wage growth. So when we look at what do we expect to see in terms of wages here, in the light, I'm going to focus on the dark blue actually. The dark blue are the 10 fastest growing professions. Now I have to, a caveat here is this was as of January of this year. The 10 fastest growing professions according to the San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation. I caution because there's food and beverage serving workers and that are in here, and maybe one other that's really hospitality related that may have been suffering. But to look at the 10 fastest growing professions, so this is what our economic development is producing in terms of jobs, only 3 of them actually can afford the rent on a typical apartment here, right, and be affordable. Only 3 of those occupations can do that. So needless to say, people are, are having 2 or 3 jobs in a household to make ends meet. But you can see it's not because they choose to, it's because it is essential. It's absolutely essential that we have multiple jobs just to make the rent in this region. And it's not a problem that's static where we didn't build enough housing and so we just need to build more housing and people fill it in. We're growing jobs that can't afford the actual rents of what new housing requires to justify building. So we have a homelessness problem as a result of these forces. When people can't afford housing, they either double up, triple up, they can live with friends, they can live in their cars, they can end up on the streets. And that is what has happened here. And it happens disproportionately. So when we talk about communities of color, that Black individuals are disproportionately affected by this has a lot to do with the fallout of the last recession. And you could talk, that's just the most recent wave of dispossession of this population. But you see folks who have the fewest resources may not have the family connections here because the family may have been broken up by economic circumstances. That you're seeing that when people become homeless, and it can sometimes be a very slender thread. Another fact that astounds me is that when you talk about the incident, when you interview people who have become homeless, who've been long-term homeless, and short-term homeless actually, it's homelessness in general, about what was the event, when did you go from being housed to unhoused? And the vast majority of them, for the vast majority of them, it was an event that was a $400 or $500 event, a car repair, a medical bill, some other surprise expense that triggered the move from being housed to being unhoused. So we have serious economic forces, and the tripwire is just, well, it's challenging. It's challenging, but it means that in large part we can address a lot of homelessness by helping people not become homeless in the first place. That is either by rapid rehousing, where we provide resources to them to pay that bill, to pay that $400 or $500. Sometimes it's short-term rent assistance because they know, hey, they're recovering from something. They can't work full-time. Someone's going to be out of a job and it's going to take a while to look. So there's, that's rapid rehousing, which can be of various forms of assistance. There can be affordable housing where the rent is low, so they're guaranteed a stable rent and a decent place to live, and that's a way that they can, on a low income, continue to afford to live. And those are critical steps toward combating homelessness. But I want to point your attention to the Community Action Plan on Homelessness. And if you read nothing else this year, I will tell you this is something to download and read. The statistics in it, the way the data is represented, it is very user-friendly, and it makes the most compelling case for what we need to do to really address homelessness on the scale of the problem in this region. So one of the things it calls for, as one of the strategies, yes, it calls for rapid rehousing. Yes, it calls for more mental health services. It calls for a better approach to how we deal with field, working in the field with individuals who are homeless. But key among those strategies is to provide enough permanent housing for folks to live, permanent supportive housing we talked about. So even with for the convention center has been a great example where we have space, we can shelter people. But shelter is not a home. Shelter doesn't solve homelessness. Shelter solves sleep, right? It's a place to sleep where you can wake up and hopefully your possessions are all in one place. But the real solution is a permanent home that you can afford. And that's what permanent supportive housing is about. So one of the key recommendations of the Community Action Plan on Homelessness is that we need to build at least 2,800 new permanent supportive housing units. And it calls out specifically that we need a local bond measure for the local capital for our share so that we can draw down the matching funds from from the state and from the feds in order to build this housing. That's what Measure A is. So this is a summary, but the conversation goes on from here. Homelessness has increased as wages have stagnated, affordable housing has been lost or not produced, and overall enough housing has not been produced. So that middle income folks are renting up, bidding up the housing that was occupied by lower income individuals. We know that the solution to homelessness is a home that someone can afford, a stable place where people can begin to rebuild their lives, to receive their benefit checks, start to begin their continuing education, to start stabilizing, their health, their well-being, and actually go out into the world and be as productive as they possibly can, whatever that means for any individual. The Community Action Plan lays out the scale of the problem, and it makes clear that we need locally generated capital if we're going to rise to the scale of that problem and provide those solutions. And we need solutions that are commensurate to the scale of the problem, and that's what Measure A is. With $900 million, we can build those 2,800 permanent supportive housing units. We can provide housing for seniors who have lived their whole lives in this community, served in various jobs, and now find themselves unable to afford the rent here. We can take care of the foster kids who have been in the foster system and then pretty much dropped by society at the age 24 without any means of support or and by the nature of their life experience without familial support. It can help us make sure that the veteran who is just getting by on a disability check or VA check can have the opportunity to live in the neighborhood that they have lived in, called home, and maybe shipped out from, in the past. A lot of folks are here because they shipped out here in the Navy, came back afterwards, and for a long time, especially downtown where we used to have single room occupancy hotels, we had 10,000 units downtown that were actually really, really inexpensive. Not always the finest, that goes back to the quality issue, but they were there, and we've destroyed 10,000 of them and replaced only 2,500 of them since the 1970s, since the birth of redevelopment. So we've created some of this problem. But we can scale it, we can come up with a solution commensurate to that scale, and that's what Measure A is all about. So with that, I would be happy to turn off the screen and just engage in that conversation.
Wow, thank you, Stephen. That was that was brilliant. That's so much good information, and it was really presented in a way that made it easy to follow. I would remind everyone that we have a Google a doc where you can either add a question or you can go in and put an asterisk by a question that you think that you really should be asked. So that's what I'm going to be drawing on right now. So Stephen, the first question comes from someone who says, there's a poster in my neighborhood that says, quote, vote no on Measure A, fight tax hikes. What would you say to those who are thinking in this way about Measure A?
Well, first of all, I didn't know that we had a registered committee against us yet. So the fact that we've actually got organized opposition is, I guess we've grown up as a campaign now. Carl DeMaio, if any of you know his name, has been actively soliciting funds to oppose us. So vote no on Measure A. Read the rest of what did it say? No tax hikes? Yeah, so let's talk about, so let's talk about the cost of this from a taxpayer's perspective. We know we need this housing. Some folks say we can deregulate our way out of this, that if we could just lower the cost of building housing, and then we'd have enough housing for everybody. That's not really true. I mean, to get to the level of where someone could afford to rent for $300 a month, we'd have to build for less than $50,000. The unit would have to cost less than $50,000, okay? There's no amount of deregulation unless we institute tents that we're going to get to $50,000, including the price of land. So I believe we need to build. Is this the most cost-effective way of building? Is it the most, people say it's kind of expensive to build in California. It's like, well, it is. It is. And that's part of the problem we have, and we have to continue to work on it, and we have worked on ways of streamlining housing production, but we're tens of thousands of units behind what we need in this region. And so if we are simply going to wait till we reform the housing production system and bring costs down in line with what our expectations of reality ought to be, we have people living and dying on the streets now. So I'm all in favor of let's figure out cheaper ways of doing this, but let's get the resources to work. If there were 10,000 people in this county homeless because of an earthquake or a wildfire, they would be in Red Cross tents tomorrow, and they would be in tents and supported until the day we could build them a new home. That's because that was a cataclysmic effect. Just because folks are the victims of slow-rolling, long-term economic cataclysms, we seem to classify them otherwise. And so I think the sense that we need to do this is strong. So we need to build now. In terms of the cost, now my video is frozen to me. I hope that you still hear me clearly. Can you give me a yes? Okay. Cost factors, like, we're talking about tax-exempt municipal bonds backed by property tax, which are some of the most stable and low-cost financing you can get in an already low-cost environment. So yes, we're going to borrow $900 million, and yes, like a mortgage, we're going to pay about double that in the lifetime of repayment. But any of you who has a household mortgage knows, well, hopefully you know, you're actually going to pay more than double what you paid for your house. If you have a 30-year mortgage with less than half down, you're going to pay a lot more. But that's because you also get useful life of the property far longer than the actual term of the payment. So what we're talking about here is some of the lowest cost capital that you could possibly apply to the problem, something where I think there's an urgency now to actually do this. Yes, it's expensive to build, and that's part of the reason why we're in this problem, but we cannot simply tell someone living on the street, please wait a couple years, a few years till we reform the system. So those I hope are sufficient answers to the question that was asked.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the next question is related. This one says, my understanding is that Measure A is a bipartisan measure. Is it rare to receive bipartisan support for a measure like this?
Well, I would call it ecumenical, not bipartisan. I don't believe in polarities as a healthy and useful way of describing the world. When I say ecumenical, I mean that we have both the AGC, Associated General Contractors, and the Labor Council supporting us. We have the taxpayers, and we have St. Paul's, St. Vincent de Paul. So we have folks from across the social spectrum, and I think it's a multidimensional spectrum, not bipolar. That's the word. It's not a duality. I will say that at the City Council we had 6 Democrats vote to put it on the ballot. We had 2 Republicans and an independent vote against even giving the voters the opportunity to vote on this, which I think is an abrogation of responsibility, unless they presented some other plans. So to call it bipartisan is a term I wouldn't choose to use for a couple of reasons, but broad spectrum, absolutely. We have a wide array of supporters. And it is unusual, especially for a tax measure.
Yeah, great. I would remind everyone to please go to the Google Doc. If you see a question that's already been written that you think should be asked, and just put an asterisk by it and we will get to it. The next one, Stephen, that seems to have some interest is this. For students or community members who want to support this measure, what can they do to get involved or contribute?
Well, first of all, yesonasandiego.org is us. Please, we have a cadre of volunteers who are doing texting, phoning. We're not doing any in-person stuff because we really want to be cautious about people's health and social and broader health issues. But they could, by going to yesonasandiego.org, you could volunteer. Watch the social media that we're putting out there. Sign up. Go to either Yes on A San Diego, all of our social media, or the Housing Federation, San Diego Housing Federation media at housingsandiego.org. Follow our social media. Tweet the stuff out that you see, that we put out there. We're trying to do an education campaign. We're not we don't see ourselves in an adversarial situation with this. We think this is an important matter that folks were educated to the issue and the way that we could solve it, that folks will embrace it. Our polling has said that's the case, and so we're doing our best. So please, go online is the best thing you can do. Pay attention to stories that actually posit positive solutions. It is hard in this day and age right now. We are really struggling, of course, with so much negativity, but there are positive solutions to this and things that we can do. So I think signing up is one of the key things we can do. Signing up on these websites.
Great, and I think we're going to have all that information available. It's actually on the Google Doc, some of those websites. So if you want to just go check that out, if you're on this in this event, you can go there. Yeah. Another question, Stephen, is if Measure A passes, how quickly do you think the housing will become available to those that need it?
That's the hardest question of all. For the first issuance, if we do $150 million today, there are enough projects lined up that we could get them going immediately. Even so, at the rate of construction, we're talking 2 to maybe 4 years for that first wave. I would hope 2 to 3. If we continue that every year for 5 or 6 years, then we're going to see probably It's going to be like a 10-year build out. I mean, I hate to be, I just don't want to overpromise. I want to sit here and be honest with you all. It's not going to be quick. We might be able to accelerate it. One of the things we're going to be pushing on as a sector, and I hope those of you who are students on this call will recognize that the affordable housing sector is an actual sector, largely dominated by nonprofits where you could do really amazing work. We're going to have a pipeline issue. We have a pipeline issue with folks at all levels, whether it's the project managers who do this or the property managers, the resident service coordinators. There's a whole host of professions that exist within affordable housing. And again, I would encourage you to go to our website if you'd like to learn more about that. There's a section on jobs there. But if we can grow that pipeline of workers in all of these fields, including the labor who's actually building this housing, then we would be in a great place to do it quicker. But it's going to be, this is a long-term plan. This is not an instant fix by any means.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. This next question is kind of like 3 questions in one, but they're related. So if you need me to repeat, just let me know. So here it is. It goes, can you speak about interesting models of market rate, not subsidized housing solutions? How do we build, quote, obtainable housing? And why is building affordable housing more expensive to build than regular market rate housing? Did you catch all that?
Yeah, so interesting models for affordable housing that don't require subsidy.
Right.
Obtainable housing in general, different models, and why is affordable housing so expensive?
Yeah.
Those are 3. Okay, we have a few minutes, right? Because this is a several-minute question. So, you know, fundamentally, housing is. So how do we put? If you want to build housing that is affordable to somebody, the cost of producing it has to be within their reach, or else you subsidize it, right? And so, as I said earlier, in San Diego, if you're going to build housing for the lowest income folks, you need to bring costs. You need to bring the actual production. The cost of the individual has to be below the cost of actually producing that housing. So that's where existing housing, of course, is naturally more can have a tendency toward affordability because it doesn't have to be built; it already exists. But because of the short housing supply, that's being bid up. There are certainly models, you know, around the world of things like cooperatives where people go in together, or land trusts where the nonprofit owns the land, which is a big part of the cost of housing. Habitat for Humanity works on a model something like this. The Community Land Trust locally does something like this, where the land is owned then by the nonprofit and is not factored into the cost of the housing. You still have to pay for the cost of the housing, and that's still essentially, if you just add materials and labor, take out the land, you still have a significant cost. So it's going to be hard to get down to real lower affordability. There's certainly ways that we could build more housing. There's explorations going on around modular housing. When we look at housing as we build it today, if you went on a job site in the suburbs and looked at them putting up stick frame construction, you flash backwards 50 years, it's going to look the same. And trust me, I know I used to sneak around housing sites all the time growing up here in San Diego. It was one of the favorite things to do as a kid. They didn't secure them quite as well back then. But you know, the housing technology hasn't really changed. We may have T2 cable running through it instead of just, you know, phone cable, but essentially the technology for building homes has not advanced much in 50 years, and we don't see any productivity gains. Of all the industrial sectors of the U.S., it may be the only one that has not seen massive or geometric even productivity gains over the last 50 years. So folks are looking at things like modular housing, full modularization where you have a whole unit as a thing that you drop in, or panels or other pieces that are prefabbed off-site. There's a great model in the San Francisco Bay Area where they produce housing in an old Navy yard, Factory OS it's called, which is a partnership with the carpenters of Northern California. It's union labor, and they produce factory housing. Now, it hasn't been brought to scale, so it isn't quite cost effective yet, but that's a way of the construction side being cheaper. So land trust can get land cheaper, factory building can bring costs down. Labor, it's always going to be really labor intensive, and so as I say, this factory housing might bring that down. To have more obtainable housing, I mean, we live in an area where we are moving toward density, and one of the challenges of living in a dense area is that the cheapest housing you can build is the sprawl that we build. So you want the cheapest housing, go to Temecula, and you can see, you know, single story on grade, you know, slab is cheap to build. As soon as you build up to 2 stories, it's a little bit more. It really gets more expensive if you have to structure your parking. So if you have to put parking underneath. So there's things we can do about disaggregating the cost of parking and housing, so not requiring parking when housing is built, but letting people make the choice of, I'm going to buy a place here, maybe a condo. I can separately negotiate to buy the housing for my car. And if I don't want that, then all I'm paying for is my housing, not my car housing. And that's something that could actually bring costs down. And there's experiments with that going down even here. Freeing up land that has been considered off limits. So like with public agencies, we've worked with, as the Federation, we've worked extensively with MTS to take their parking lots that were underutilized and try to turn those into transit-oriented development. But it's not cheap when you build above. You know, once you start building higher, the per unit cost per square foot actually goes up. So, you know, the density we need from an environmental standpoint to be clustered in villages is not the cheapest way to build. However, the long-term costs and the long-term savings in terms of the environment are enormous. So those are reasons, so that kind of touches on some of the cost drivers. And we talk about why is affordable housing, quote unquote, so expensive. First of all, it's not really, it's almost nominally, it's pretty close. I mean, honestly, it's almost the same. When you look at the city of San Diego, over the last 5 years, we've averaged about $325,000 a unit. People will quote outliers, and yes, I could quote some outliers as well to say, well, look, at this happened. Well, that was in some cases maybe a historic building that needed a huge seismic retrofit, and there were political reasons why we had to fix it up instead of tear it down. You know, as a building. What we do see also, though, that can drive cost is when you hear about the challenges that affordable housing has moving into a neighborhood. So we can see extra cost in the process of, and I see Elaine on this call, and she could talk to you all day about what it meant to try to build a very simple, modest, permanent supportive housing project in Claremont, and the fact that the time and energy spent just in the process is extended if there's community opposition. Furthermore, in a lot of cases, because these votes are sensitive, the electeds who are also putting in financing, right? So your underwriter as well as your land use authority ask you to do extra things, and you can't tell your underwriter no, because they'll throw in some extra money to make sure if the neighborhood is all upset about, you know, let's sweeten the pot a little bit, let's make it, you know, repair the streets, contribute to a park, put in a traffic light. There are costs that get added on to make this housing either palatable to the community or contribute to the fulfillment of a community plan that a private developer wouldn't be pushed to do. And certainly in the case of a private developer, his underwriter is the bank and the approving authority is here. They're not one and the same. And so the bank is going to push back against, we're only going to lend you so much money. We're not going to give you $1 more. With affordable housing, there's a tendency in many cases, especially jurisdictions have, will often put on, this actually happened in San Diego, I think Solana Beach, where they had 50 some parking spaces for a 10-unit building because they wanted the project to actually create beach parking available for the public. So a public facility was put on top of this particular property. So those exactions that happen in those cases can be a contributor to the additional cost. Most affordable housing costs only nominally more, and a lot of that has to do with processing and the complexity of financing it. So that's, I think that answered the 3 questions. Yeah, no. But I'm happy to go back.
Wow, no, I think you did. And you're really demonstrating how complex and how interrelated a lot of different issues are with homelessness and housing. So we really appreciate that. You mentioned at the beginning, please go ahead, yeah. Stephen.
I just want to share a slide because one of the things that we talk about a lot is economic justice and redlining. And if you're familiar with, and I'm going to actually show this image. Let's see here. Screen 1, share screen, because a lot of folks aren't aware of. Are you seeing the redlining screen here? The blue map and a.
Yes, we are, Stephen.
Okay, so the one with the this is a redlining map. If you haven't seen one, they're kind of shocking because you hear about redlining, but to realize that we live where redlining happens. This white square in the middle is Balboa Park, just to give you a point of reference. And redlining, of course, was an effort to federal government gave the charge to local entities to rate the risks of lending mortgages in various metropolitan areas in the United States back before the war and into post-war, into the 60s. And what they did is they actually did either local government officials, oftentimes working with local realtors, would assess and grade these neighborhoods. And so, for instance, this is Kensington. I don't know if you can see my little cursor arrow. You can see where Kensington is green. What that meant, and I will quote from these reports, is that the green areas are places where you had a singularity of of white homeowners with well-maintained yards and no inharmonious uses. That is to say, it was all housing and nothing else, nominal. Blue was a step down from that. By the time you got to yellow, the descriptions would say inharmonious uses, retail or maybe commercial properties next to housing. And some mixing of races would often be implied or explicitly stated. And then, of course, in the redlined areas, it was predominantly lived in by, and they didn't say persons of color. They used a variety of other terms to describe that these were areas that were undesirable. So these were risk maps as far as you could get premium rates, mortgage rates in the green areas, pretty good in the blue, maybe a little bit above market in the yellow, and you maybe couldn't get a guaranteed loan at all in the red areas. And we talk about that because if you look at the blue map here, which is folks most at risk of falling short on their rent, so people really who are on the brink of housing insecurity, this area, the dark blue, which exactly corresponds with this area, because Balboa Park is right here in the center, and you look at this dark blue is exactly concurrent with these areas that were redlined back in the pre-war eras. So we have some systemic problems we're dealing with, and these are the same folks, by the way, where you're seeing the black community that is being dispossessed of homes where maybe they built up some equity, had some subprime loans, they were predatory lenders, they were dispossessed, became renters or lost their homes altogether. And so you see this perpetuation of decades of social injustices that culminate in the conditions we see on the streets today. So it's important when people say, well, why should we be paying for it? It's because we benefited from this. Generations, I'm only the second generation homeowner in my family, and I had my parents, provided me with $3,000 back in 1993 to help me buy my first home, and it was significant back then. Not everybody has that, and these days, a huge number of buyers have that opportunity of intergenerational wealth transfer, the $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 to help them buy a home. But in these areas, we don't have that, and it's if the rungs are taken away from you on the wealth ladder, and then hard times hit. We are all part of the system that has produced the homelessness issue on our streets. We all have a duty to contribute a little bit. And if it's 98 cents a month, you're living in an apartment. If it's $1.60 a month because you're living in your own home, God bless. Can't we maybe find a little bit of heart and a little bit of change in our pockets?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for sharing that slide. That was really important. I think we're going to do one more question. You mentioned at the very beginning that nonprofits are doing much of the work in San Diego County, not only in housing, but a lot of other sort of important social issues. And I'm curious, what do you think of the role of elected local officials? Are they doing as much as they should be doing? Should they be doing more? What is your feeling about their activity in this arena?
Well, we've got 18 cities in the county, so about 19 jurisdictions in San Diego County, and I could go through and rate them. There are certain, but to maybe pick some extremes, we have an area like Encinitas where the city itself has been resistant to producing housing for folks who are lower income, or even zoning multifamily land to meet their basic legal requirements. They've lost that, and they have an incredible leader there. Mayor Catherine Blakespear is just an amazing, bold leader. I mean, she brings heart to that, and she explains to the community why some things are necessary. They stand up there and yell at, they come to speak at these public meetings, the public does, and yells at council members. And it's hard, I get it. There are some who simply hide behind that and pander to the NIMBYs in the neighborhoods because it's an easier way to get elected. And the solutions we offer are not short-term solutions. When I talk about a 10-year building program, maybe from day one till we have, that's more than 2 terms on a city council in most places. And folks need to see within 4 years, if they're going to get reelected, in a lot of places, they need to show results. And so it's been all over the place. I mean, I would say the county just recently with Nathan Fletcher becoming part of that has changed the dynamic entirely. He's actually won over Diane Jacob as a supporter, and so she's been supporting housing in Ramona, for instance. There's a senior project there and this innovative housing trust fund that they've created at the county. It was, anemic, honestly, but it was a first step. you know, they actually did it, and they've contributed properties to producing it. So the answer is all over the place. So I guess the real question is, what should we expect from these electeds? And what we should expect is the kind of leadership we've seen with someone like a Chris Ward, with someone like a Nathan Fletcher, someone like a Catherine Blakespear. We look at Mary Salas in Chula Vista, the mayor, who's been amazing in terms of advocating for affordable housing there. You know, we should expect folks to take the long view, to take their job as an elected official seriously for the reasons of public service, and deal with facts. And you know, and our partnership with nonprofits, we're in a position where we can say things that other people can't say. There's not enough of us. So if there's something that any one of you can do here is, you know, join the Housing Federation. For $25, you could be a community member, or just follow our stuff, and you know, or follow the council meetings in your particular city, or look at the housing committees that exist, and just find a way to be engaged. The local planning committee. You know, we need voices of people who care and who are willing to rise above the knee-jerk, not them here, not now. We need people who can say affirmatively, no, in my community, I want this, and we need to be everywhere. So if there's one thing that every one of you can do is be a part of your community groups and raise your voices and ask, or if you're afraid to make an affirmative statement, ask a question of somebody, just to ask them to justify their position. But best of all, you know, read, get educated, and speak up at these meetings, because the electeds need us behind them to find the courage of their convictions.
Wow. You know, Stephen, I've been really fortunate last year to be on multiple calls with you, and every single time I learned something new. You are a true gift to our community for everything you're doing. So thank you very, very much for talking with us today and for bringing your wisdom and your passion.